to episode 272 of Cinematary. I'm your host, Zach Dennis, and I'm here with
Andrew Swafford,
Nathan Smith.
And in today's episode, we will be talking about movies that we saw this week in part one. And in part two, we will be continuing our Best of the Decade series with the year 2011.
We'll also be talking about it very quietly because...
But we're going to be talking about it very quietly
in
because
his office covering the current election.
Yeah, I'm getting spied on at the moment. So let's go ahead and jump into movies that we saw this week. Nathan, I'm going to kick off with you because you have a review of a movie that I caught at TIFF. I wrote about it briefly, but you have a piece coming out in the Nashville scene. I guess it'll probably be out by the time this episode drops.
It is out.
Yeah, it's online right now, and it will be in the paper. I think the paper comes out in Nashville on Thursday if you happen to live in that zip code. But yeah, Jojo Rabbit, the new movie from Taika Waititi, who is a filmmaker who I like well enough. You know, What We Do in the Shadows is a nice movie. Boy is a nice movie. Of the Marvel movies, Thor Ragnarok is maybe one of the nicer Marvel movies. You know, I don't know, he's just pleasant,
one of the least bad.
Yeah, they're just all, you know, they're always, his movies are always you know, kind of a pleasant, wholesome but slightly deadpan ironic time. You know, I feel like he is very influenced by Jared Hess, he of Napoleon Dynamite and Nacho Libre, and kind of comes from that school of deadpan verbal comedy mixed with a very sort of specific detailed visual style. But this movie unfortunately did not really work for me. It's still very much in that kind of comic tone. You know, Taika Waititi plays Hitler, who is the imaginary best friend of this young Nazi boy named Jojo, who loves the uniform, loves the swastika, loves to go to little Nazi camp, but he can't quite get down with all the meanness and all the brutality and all the book burning. You know, he feels a little bit queasy about it. And lo and behold, his beliefs are put to the test when he discovers that his mother, played by Scarlett Johansson, is this sort of, not really like resistance fighter, but she like goes around town leaving these like basically bumper stickers that say like "Free Germany." And she's also hiding a young Jewish girl in their attic. Jojo discovers the girl, and the girl kind of uses his insane, absurd fears of Jews against him to, like, you know, basically maintain her safety in the house. And he realizes, oh, this is actually like a person, and she's very nice and pleasant, and we're friends, and it challenges his beliefs, and, you know, he learns a nice little lesson about hate and about treating people well. But it's just fundamentally, I feel like, is kind of a failed movie. Like, it just, I don't know, just setting out to make this movie about like a little Nazi who learns his lesson and learns to not be a Nazi is just kind of like, why even make a movie about a Nazi? Like, why, you know?
Well, I think a lot of people know why we're making movies about Nazis in 2019, right?
I mean, right, but it's just kind of, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's you know, supposed to be, you know, the movie is branded as an anti-hate satire and is supposed to be kind of an allegory for today. And I think there's some kind of interesting ways that you can read this movie. Like, there's something that Scarlett Johansson said in the movie that reminded me almost of just like, I don't know, what a mother whose like son is radicalized by YouTube would say about just like how her son has kind of changed without, you know, her even realizing it. So I think, and there are these kind of like more subtle parallels to today, but it's just like, it is kind of predicated on a lot of just Like, it's basically predicated on the kind of the assumption that there are like good Nazis, you know. It has all these characters in the movie, like Sam Rockwell plays this, like, I guess, Nazi officer who is really ridiculous and designs a crazy costume, but he has a heart of gold, and he takes pity on Jojo and is kind to Jojo's mother, even though she's a kind of resistance leader. But it's just like, this guy is still a Nazi. Like, at the end of the movie, the guy is still putting on this crazy Nazi regalia and like willingly fighting in the war. And you have all these like cute little kids who you're kind of supposed to feel sympathy for, but it's like, these kids are still Nazis. Like, they're kids, and the whole point of the movie is that, like, oh, you know, children haven't fully thought through their beliefs, and, you know, sometimes they kind of mimic what society tells them, and that doesn't have to define who they are. They can overcome it. But it's just like, I don't know, the kind of the movie's line of critique is basically saying, like, you know, just because you put on a swastika and say anti-Semitic things doesn't mean you're a Nazi. Like, there's a moment in the movie where Elsa, the Jewish girl, says to Jojo, you know, Jojo's like, I'm a Nazi. And she's like, no, you're not. You're just a kid who likes to put on a costume. And it's like, yeah, he's a kid. But I think if we've learned anything from the past few years, it's that when somebody puts on a swastika and wears it in public, that you, like, shouldn't doubt their beliefs and their sincerity.
Or that it doesn't matter whether they're sincere.
Exactly. Like, what they're advocating, you know, regardless of the intent of their advocation, is still a dangerous, violent thing. So it's kind of predicated on those kind of assumptions that there are like good Nazis, or that it's even worth like redeeming them. And I think ultimately the kind of movie, instead of like, because it feels a little bit like I kind of felt watching Black Klansman last year, where it was like, who is this movie for? A little bit, because the people who are probably going to see it are people who don't need to be converted. The people who need to be converted probably are not going to see this movie. So instead of kind of going about like trying to logically critique the movie, you know, Nazis, it feels like it's basically just trying to say, oh, like, if you have these beliefs, you're really childish, and we're just going to sort of make fun of you until you cry and wise up.
It's also a movie that, and this is a problem with a lot of movies that deal with like Nazi narratives. It's a movie that completely erases the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I mean, it mentions the existence of the Holocaust, but it also, it's just kind of like a passing line. It's not like, and I don't know, it kind of just passes over that, and I'm like, no, you have to like engage with, you can't just ignore the Holocaust,
right? And it has,
while you're making this thing about Nazis.
And just going hand in hand with that, it has no sense of like Jewish identity or culture or anything like that. You know, you have this character Elsa, and Jojo is constantly bothering her, like, oh, tell me about your people, you know, are all the crazy stories true? And she just uses it as this opportunity to like toy and make fun of his, you know, insane assumptions about like Jews being winged monsters or something like that. You know, there's no real sense of like what it means for her to, you know, to be Jewish. It's just kind of like very sort of glossed over and very vague. And along with that, there is, like you said, you know, the Holocaust is just like not a thing. The movie is, Nazism is just this sort of outward identity, you know, this like costume that you put on. And to me, the movie, the kind of critique that I felt like it was making most of all, you know, you have this opening credit sequence where footage from Triumph of the Will is set to the Beatles' German version of I Want to Hold Your Hand, and you see all these screaming crowds, and it sort of draws this parallel to Beatlemania. And so basically the movie is just saying that Nazism is a kind of like crazy stan culture, that its practitioners are not dangerous people, but just like infantile teeny boppers, and that you don't need to be scared or worried about them because they're just children, they're just babies. And that just,
they're going to grow out of it.
Yeah, that just feels like dangerous to me a little bit, and a little too easy. You know, it's kind of an easy way out.
Well, and a little, I mean, honestly, I mean, maybe this is a harsh word for it, but a little bit reprehensible. I mean, you can't gloss over this and expect people to read into the deeper meanings that, like, we're kind of talking about what he's trying to get across. I mean, the fact that you're going to show that, the fact that you're going to ignore the Holocaust completely, it just seems like you're like trying to make a point and allow us to fill in the blanks on the stuff that really needs to be dealt with. And that just seems like, one, lazy directing and lazy writing, and two, it's expecting, again, it's kind of the point that you made, it's who is this audience playing for? Because if it's playing for the audience that we kind of assume, then they probably already know that stuff, and they're just kind of getting the kicks off of the absurdity of the characters in this thing.
I read a little bit of the Nashville Scene piece, Nathan, and I liked the point you made comparing the way in which this movie goes about mocking the Nazis for the aesthetic stuff. You compared that to liberals on Facebook making fun of Trump and calling him orange, right? Yeah. Which there is definitely a cottage industry in just feeding anti-Trump, like silly anti-Trump memes to liberals who are already convinced, and then all of that stuff, all of that media quote unquote critique is kind of reinforce a certain feedback loop that, like, it on a certain level is good. Like, people should like be constantly reminded that Trump is bad and that white supremacy is bad and that fascism is encroaching and all these things, but it's also like unproductive at the end of the day. Like, what do you do with that?
Yeah, how is that constructively having a conversation? You're having a conversation, but you're just kind of, again, like you said, you're just talking in a loop. You're not really like furthering the dialogue about about what you're talking about. You're just kind of running around in circles, and that's pretty much what this movie is it's the Facebook meme of Nazi movies, I guess.
Basically, and a movie that was on my mind while watching it, a movie that we talked about a number of years ago, the documentary Night and Fog by Alan Renee.
Yes.
Just because if Taika Waititi's thesis is that Nazis are children, I feel like the real horror of the Holocaust and the real horror of Nazism is not that they were childish or buffoonish or silly, Exactly. It's that they were adults, that they spent years and mobilized thousands upon thousands of people in service of a very calculated and mechanized genocide. That is the real horror of it, is that they were able to do it in such a cold, adult-like way, and not the childishness of it, not the aesthetic. And speaking of aesthetics, the movie also just seems a little bit too gleefully fascinated with the Nazi look to me, like not just Taika parading around dressed like Hitler, but like the closing credits, you have the directed by Taika Waititi title card and everybody else's names in the sort of red, white, and black, of the Nazi flag. And that just felt a little gross to me, because I get that it's a kind of parody or something, but it just felt like you are identifying yourself, not really at the end of the day with the actually oppressed people, but with the oppressor. And the oppressed people in the movie have nothing to them other than that oppression. And it was just like, Zach, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that it's a little bit reprehensible. That is absolutely how I felt watching this.
Yeah, well, it's definitely one that I'm sure will probably, because it's going to be getting a wide release relatively soon.
Is it worth watching? Like, it's opening in Knoxville this weekend. Should I go, or should I just
I think you should watch it, because I'd be curious to like hear your conversation about it. I don't know how much different it'll be than what we're saying. I think we're probably all on the same wavelength, but at least I'd be curious to like get your perspective on it regardless, because I think it is you saw it at the Nashville Film Festival, but if you kind of look at how this film deals with Nazis compared to like Hidden Life, it's two interesting case studies.
Seeing the trailer for that before Jojo Rabbit, I didn't see that yet, but it was just like very jarring, the gravity, the difference in levity, between the two movies.
Yeah. But Jojo Rabbit, it's popping up around places now, but I'm sure we'll probably have more people who have seen it soon. Nathan, I'm going to keep it over with you, though, because you also caught a movie that's on the Criterion Channel.
It actually, unfortunately, just left, but it is a pre-code movie directed by William Wellman, and his movies tend to come and go from the service, so I feel like it might come back at some point. But it's called The Purchase Price, and it stars Barbara Stanwyck, and it was on the Criterion Channel as part of their like pre-code Barbara Stanwyck series. And this is maybe my fourth movie I've seen by William Wellman. The great thing about them is that they're all pretty much like 60 to 80 minutes. This one is 68 minutes. And it is about a nightclub performer played by Barbara Stanwyck who is dating a gangster and needs to run away from him. So she handily finds out that the maid who cleans her apartment has signed up to be a mail order bride and is corresponding with a farmer in North Dakota. But the maid reveals to Barbara Stanwyck that, she's going to go meet this guy and move out to North Dakota, but she's a little bit nervous because she used Barbara Stanwyck's pictures and sent the guy Barbara Stanwyck's pictures and not her own. So this guy's expecting Barbara Stanwyck, and the maid is not Barbara Stanwyck, and she's a little bit worried that she's going to be upset. So Barbara Stanwyck, looking to flee, is like, well, let me, switch places with you. I'll give you some money. And this guy will get a surprise, it'll actually be beautiful old me. And I'll be able to, run away from this life of crime. So she goes to North Dakota, and the town is like really wild. There's like a crazy party scene where everybody comes over to her and her husband's house and just like takes over, and they're getting drunk and singing all these songs. And it's just like I don't know. It was just like it's a very wacky movie. It's so short, but there is just so much packed in, that it goes from a gangster movie to this kind of romantic comedy, to then later in the movie, her boyfriend comes back and is trying to win her back, and it takes this more serious turn. At the end of the movie, it almost turns into like Days of Heaven for a minute, and it gets like very serious. And it was just like one of those, I don't know, one of those kind of classic experiences of like watching some little old Hollywood movie where you don't really know exactly like what you're in for. You think it's maybe, I don't know, a romance or a crime movie, but then it just ends up being all of these things sort of crammed into one. And I just had a lot of fun with it because it felt like a legitimately kind of unpredictable movie where I had absolutely no idea what was going to happen in the next moment. And just like I really like movies from this era, Westerns, but also kind of movies like this that aren't Western, but are more pastoral, that are just set in the country or set in farms where they just have these like very rich communities where you have all of these side characters who just kind of, on first glance, that they have some kind of rich, rough life and a very rugged history. So I don't know. I was just like, had no expectations going into this movie and was very surprised. And had a lot of fun with it. I think William Wellman has like, he directed like 70 movies, and this is kind of the experience I've had with a lot of them so far, like Frisco Jenny, and Safe in Hell is another one, where it's just like totally bonkers and goes in a bunch of different unexpected directions. And it's both really light and fun and thrilling, but also like very grave and kind of melodramatic and serious in other moments. So
interesting. Well, hopefully it'll
definitely recommend checking this one out.
Yeah, hopefully it'll make its way back on the Criterion Channel.
Hopefully so.
Or it might be check your YouTube.
Yeah, that's always a good...
Check your local YouTube.
Check your local YouTube.
Thank you, YouTube.
Andrew, I'm gonna toss it over to you. You caught a season 2 of a I guess TV movie, however you want to describe it, that you really enjoyed from a few years back.
This week of all weeks is probably a bad time to reopen the conversation about what is movies and what is not, with all the Martin Scorsese superhero movies are not cinema discourse happening right now. But I wanted to talk about the show, season 2 by Kaveh Zahidi. We talked about the first movie / series a couple of years back, and just for the record, it has played at Sundance. I think both seasons have played at Sundance as features, and they get released as like these 90-minute blocks of film, but whatever. The original show about the show is exactly what it sounds like. It is this New York City filmmaker, Kaveh Zahidi, making a show about pitching a TV show and then making another episode or segment about the creation of the last episode or segment, and then making an episode about the creation of that episode, and so on and so forth. And it becomes very meta and very funny. It is this video experiment about the process of making art and how making art kind of affects the lives of the people making it, which is heightened by Kaveh's singular personality and his commitment to, I don't know if he calls it this, but other people call it radical honesty, where just like basically any passing thought that comes through his head that he feels like hiding from someone, he instead reveals it to them in an effort to be completely transparent and be completely himself. And when you're making art about those passing thoughts and you're showing how the creation of that art is affecting people around you, that quickly spins out into total chaos. There are these offhand remarks about like women he finds attractive or fantasies he has that make these huge ripple effects in his marriage, as well as like just these constellations of other relationships that all get affected by Kaveh's honesty and the way he's documenting it. There will be scenes where he's like vlogging about a certain actor's performance, and then the actor sees it in the next episode and gets upset with him about that, and they have to dramatize that conversation. And it's very funny. It has this interesting editing style where you're mostly watching Kaveh in front of a black screen talking directly to the camera about the process of making the episode, but he also like plays around a lot with cutaways. Like every single time he mentions somebody, he will flash their face up on the screen for a second, and there are many layers of actors playing actors because people drop in and out of the show at various points because they're uncomfortable with Kaveh's process. And this version, So About the Show season 2, is I liked it much less. That was one of my favorite video things of that year, and this one I feel like has a lot less spark to it, and is also a little bit harder to laugh off. It gets very serious and heavy at times, which I'm sure will be a pro for some people, but I was uncomfortable with it for various reasons. This is not really a show about the show anymore. He's no longer doing the layered episode format or structure, or he's not making an episode about the creation of the previous episode. He's just documenting in real time things that are happening in his life and the state of his various relationships. And so it more becomes a show about Kaveh's marriage, which was already really strained after a certain point in the first season. And here it just spins out further and further and further. There are a couple of different women who he kind of expresses interest in the first season, and none of those relationships really go anywhere. But the oddest one, the most out there coupling that as soon as you hear about it, you're like, no, 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 no. That becomes front and center in season 2. There's this woman who becomes a fan of Kaveh through the internet. Her name is Ashley, and she makes these kind of obsessive vlogs about him. And she's much younger than him. She's 24. I don't know, Nathan, would you say he's like in his 50s or something? I should probably look this up.
I think 50s, yeah.
Yeah, he's like twice her age, at least. And it's a weird, like, student-teacher dynamic, or even, like, father-daughter dynamic, because she's so much younger than him, and she kind of looks up to him as this role model and doesn't see herself as his equal. And that becomes the center of this season, where he tries to open his marriage and pursue a relationship with this woman. Meanwhile, his wife is pursuing flings with various partners, and this woman that he's seeing also has a steady boyfriend, and Kaveh is kind of a fling for her. And there are a lot of other extraneous people on the sidelines too. And I mean, you can see how this is a recipe for absolute disaster, right? This is nothing but people's feelings getting hurt. Again and again and again on a loop. And there are sections of this that play with that fact, play with this on again, off again dynamic Kaveh has with his wife, where she will say, I'm done with this, I want a divorce. And then, 20 minutes later, she will say, I want to try and make this work out. And so he'll try and find like arrangements outside of the marriage, then they will get squashed, and then do it again and they'll get squashed. And the experience of watching season 2, I found to be still funny at times, just because Kaveh's cadence is funny and the editing style is funny, but honestly, pretty bleak in terms of just thinking about the I'm taking Kaveh at his word. I'm assuming real people who are really being affected by this, and like Kaveh's real kids being affected by this. Like they are not even depicted in this season or movie or whatever you want to call it, because the wife has ethical concerns about them being on camera for this thing, and so they're painted over in this interesting, like almost rotoscoped, like waking lifestyle animation on top of them. And so thinking about them being affected and Kaveh being like kicked out of his house at a certain point, it all seems so destructive that it stops being fun pretty early on and just continues spiraling from there. It does have a really moving ending that gets undercut with a joke that I don't know how I feel about. But Nathan, I'll be very curious to hear your take on this whenever you get around to watching it. I know you also really loved the first show about the show. But that's kind of my stance on it. There were still things to enjoy about it, but I felt a lot ickier about this one in comparison to the kind of formal playfulness of the first show about the show.
And where can you watch it?
It is all on YouTube. There's a channel called Brick TV based in Brooklyn that has a playlist of all the season 1 stuff and all the season 2 stuff, and you can just hit play and watch it straight through like a movie.
Well, this is a movie that I know Nathan saw a couple weeks ago, but Andrew, you just caught it, and it seems to be the movie that everybody has access to except for me.
Yeah.
The movie is Parasite. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my headphones off because I don't want to be spoiled.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, so we are going to talk about spoilers, and I will type a chat to you, Zach, whenever we're done talking about spoilers, so you can go ahead and step away now. It's weird that we're only just now getting this movie, because it's been talked about since Cannes. It got the Palme d'Or, and it seems like it's been a constant topic of conversation every single week since Cannes. And like, there's just been this wave of people on Twitter like, oh, I finally get to see Parasite this week. And it seems like it is most places now. If you have any level of arts theater, it is playing, because this is a movie that I actually see doing really well with a wide audience. It's a crowd-pleasing movie. It's kind of a popcorn movie. It's this pot-boiling thriller. It reminds me of Hitchcock in a lot of ways. But I guess the the synopsis of the film, to give the basic synopsis before we get into later act spoiler stuff, is it's about this very, very low income family who is living in this almost like hole in the wall in like a basement on a busy city street. It seems like maybe they're squatting there. It's not really clear. There are points where a fumigation dude walks by and they like open all their windows so they can get their apartment or whatever it is fumigated. But the movie spends a little bit of time at the beginning just establishing just how poor this family is, and also just how hard they're hustling to try and make ends meet. Like they are not paying for Wi-Fi. They're struggling to like find free Wi-Fi because they don't want to spare that expense. They are doing these really demoralizing, tedious tasks like folding pizza boxes for pizza delivery companies, and then like finding like life hack ways to do it faster. And then an opportunity arises for one of them to be an English tutor for an extremely like unfathomably rich family. And then the basic conceit of the film is one by one, they all kind of insert themselves into the family's employment without letting that family know that they are also related. So he gets the sister employed by the family being an art tutor, and he gets the dad employed by the family being a limo driver, or not a limo driver, but a private, luxury car driver. He gets his mom in the family being a live-in housekeeper. And so they're kind of living under this family's auspices without them being aware, and they're sort of leeching off of them in a way, as the title suggests. But they're also, being good capitalists and taking opportunities when they find them, and just taking advantage of opportunities to move up the ladder. And then it gets much stranger, but I liked the movie a lot. Like I said, I thought it was really thrilling, and I was watching it with Jesse and my two sisters, and they were both just constantly gasping at the new revelations that would unfold every 10 minutes. So it is just really attention grabbing in that respect. On a plot level, it really moves, and it's also filmed in this really confident, interesting way as well. Bong Joon-ho moves his camera in a lot of these clean lines and 90-degree angles, and puts barriers between people, both like vertically and horizontally, to kind of show people being like above and below each other, and kind of being separated by these material things that the movie is very much focusing on. And so I thought, like, on a craft level, on an entertainment level, it was kind of firing on all cylinders. I really, really liked it. And it's also, like, really thematically rich, we can talk about as well. But Nathan, what did you think of Parasite in general?
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I feel like it's very rare that a movie is as hyped as this has been, and lives up to the hype for at least...
Yeah.
It seems like most people seeing this movie like it a lot. I was a little bit nervous going into it just because I really did not like his last movie, Okja.
I didn't either. God, I disliked it.
Yeah, and it's been a few years and I would have to revisit it, but like over time I've kind of lessened on Snowpiercer as well.
Oh man, I still really like Snowpiercer.
I don't know. It's just, I should revisit it, but just kind of thinking about it, some parts of it felt a little clunky to me. But this movie is just like a very seamlessly directed, it's a very kind of, it's very directed and feels very planned out and meticulously crafted, but is, while being kind of showy in that way, is more restrained than something like Okja, which was just absurdity,
Unhinged,
and just kind of excessive.
This feels like a well-planned trap, like unfolding upon you, right?
Absolutely. It's like very much, I feel like, kind of a screenplay dependent movie, because it is so narratively satisfying. Like all the ends come together perfectly, and there's, you know, as you mentioned, you know, it's like there's a reason to gasp every 10 minutes because it takes a lot of twists and turns, but none of them necessarily feel unearned. And it strikes that nice ground between being like surprising while not being necessarily shocking. Like it all logically makes sense. It's not like a kind of mind-bending reality plot twist. It's like there's only one thing that maybe qualifies as a twist. Yeah.
But everything else is just like, wow, we're really going here. We are just turning this into another thing.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it feels like, you know, everybody, you know, it obviously deserves comparison to like Hitchcock, but I was also thinking a lot about David Fincher, because it's just this kind of like elegant modernist digital thriller that is really juicy and pulpy, but also has a nice kind of class analysis. I do think, I mean, I think that it's very rich thematically, and it has a lot going on that you can talk about, but I do feel like thematically it maybe ties up not quite as nicely as it does narratively for me, at least. Like there's
So let's talk about that, because I almost subtweeted you when I got out of the theater and I saw you and Esther Rosenfield going back and forth about whether or not the movie was anti-capitalist enough. And I almost tweeted that like Seinfeld gif of him just like putting his hands up and walking out of the theater. Because I felt like it was very capitalist in a very nuanced way, or very anti-capitalist in a nuanced way. Like I had a conversation recently with a coworker who had recently watched Snowpiercer, and maybe the coworker is just not as anti-capitalist as I am, but he was, one of his critiques of the film was that it was too blunt and too simplistic of an allegory. And I told him today, like, well, if that's your critique of Snowpiercer, you're going to really like Parasite because of just like how detailed and like in the nitty gritty of what it has to say about capitalism it gets. But what were your critiques on that front?
So I think what the movie, for me at least, is incredibly rich, and there's a lot to discuss in terms of what it says about like emotional labor and effective labor, which basically, you know, I mean, emotional labor is a terribly misused term these days, but basically, you know, meaning the management and regulation of your emotions, and also there's an aesthetic component to that as well, you know, managing your appearance to satisfy an employer or customer, which is especially difficult and kind of messy and complicated in the domestic sphere, where the lines between family and employee, especially in this kind of situation where there's a, you know, live-in housekeeper, you know, that gets like super complicated. So I think there's a lot it's very rich on that front.
And also like the emotional drain of being someone who is low class, just seeing the conspicuous consumption, the extravagant expenditure of, you know, there's a scene where right after the main family's, the protagonist family's house has just been flooded, they're then called to help plan this ridiculously lavish birthday party. And for this kid who's not even going to remember this party, right? And just like watching the emotional processing of that and the look on these characters' faces as they're just watching like how just the immorality of the existence of this thing that they're being asked to participate in. And then the father even says like, I'm paying you extra for this. Like you can't appear unenthused right now. There's money on the line. You kind of have to go along with it.
Yeah. And I think that it, God, I just forgot where I was going. I was going to continue on that.
Where do you think that people are seeing it not being anti-capitalist enough?
I think what it is, I think a critical, I mean, you mentioned that, you know, the difference, Snowpiercer is a lot more blunt, which maybe I would retract some of what I said about Snowpiercer just a minute ago, because actually thinking about it, I think the kind of the difference in the ending of the movies is really key to me, where big spoiler time.
Yeah.
Then in
Yeah,
Snowpiercer, the train crashes and you have just these two kids left in the snow who, if I remember correctly, don't even speak the same language, who have to like build, civilization all over again.
And the train is like an allegory for the capitalist system, and they're like escaping the capitalist system, and they see this polar bear on the hillside, and it's sort of implying visually that, it's possible to make a life out here. They're just going to have to find a new way to do it.
Yeah. Whereas the end of this movie, you have the son basically like fantasizing how he's going to save his father. Right, exactly.
Save his father through capitalism, right? He's going to pick himself up by his bootstraps, make enough money to buy this house that his father is now like holed up in, which is another spoiler we kind of jumped over. The father kind of finds this secret basement that he can live in after the family has moved out, the rich family has moved out. And so the son thinks, I'm just going to make enough money to buy this house, and then my father will be able to live in it with me as like a legitimate member of my family. When I was watching that, I was thinking the same thing, that like, is this movie kind of positing that, people can solve their capitalist problems by just kind of working their way out of it? Because there is this kind of romantic glow to the boys' daydream about this future. But then I felt that the last shot or shots of the movie, I don't remember exactly how many there are, really undercut the fantasy of that, as it like brings you back to reality, where it's like much darker and more like blue, and it's raining outside, and you're just kind of left with this bleak moment of like, well, that's never going to happen. Like somebody like me never moves up that high. This is like Gatsby rich.
Yeah, I mean, the end of the movie does totally reveal that it's this fantasy and kind of puts you back into this bleak reality. I think, though, the problem and this is not fully my critique, I don't fully agree with it. I see where people are coming from. I think that some people had the same kind of critique about Nocturama a few years ago, which, again, I could see, but I don't totally agree with. But just that, yes, it is bleak, but that at a certain point, it's not enough to just like remind people of the kind of bleak state of capitalism, that you have to start imagining a little bit of a kind of new, better reality beyond that, which I think at the end of
which Snowpiercer implies.
It suggests open for, but Parasite just sort of suggests that this is just this bleak, depressing cycle that's going to continue for seemingly forever.
And that violent revolution is unsatisfying and also ineffective, right? Because there is a sort of revolution scene where people are literally moving up vertically in the frame from the basement to the main house and just like taking people out.
Yeah.
And it's really painful and not cathartic, and again, like not effective at achieving any sort of goals. So yeah, I could see that critique of like it doesn't offer an alternative, but I don't know. When I wrote my review of Ready or Not, which I thought was really smart in certain things when it was kind of making an anti-capitalist allegory, I had the critique like, well, this movie doesn't really say exactly why the rich are immoral or evil, right? It just says that the rich are the villains in this movie, and therefore we need to escape from them and also maybe kill them. But it was like, well, I think a lot of people need convincing on that idea. Like, what do the rich do that is just unjust, right? And my friend Cam, who's a patron and has been on the podcast before, said like, well, we probably need more just like blunt, unnuanced, anti-rich agitprop out in the world. There's like nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's maybe not the only thing we need, but as a thing we need, he was glad that existed. And I was pretty convinced by that argument, and think the same thing. I thought the same thing when I was talking to my coworker about Snowpiercer being too blunt. But we should. There's more to say about Parasite, especially about like the way in which just the system kind of turns the lower class characters against each other. I think that is worth talking about and writing about in much more depth. It's a movie where there's no villain other than the driving like capitalist motivations behind everybody's eyes. So there's more to say, but this has been a long part one, and we got to get Zach back on here. Yeah. So I'm just going to
I'm sure we'll be in our probably top 10 of the year, so we'll have reason to talk about it.
Okay, hopefully Zach is about to come back on.
Up.
Okay.
He's back.
We just spoiled everything.
I heard capitalism, and then I came back.
Yeah.
Like a beast. All right, we're going to take a short break, and we will be back talking 2011. We're going back in time, bitches, after this.
Hey, Cinematariats, this is your co-host Lydia Creech with an important message during this break in the show. Cinematary would like you to know that we definitely want your money. We still want to bring you our pure, unadulterated opinions on the world of cinema, but now we're getting into the Patreon game, baby. We've brought on a lot of new voices to contribute to the site, and we want to honor our responsibility to compensate all these smart people for their hard work. To help us out, head over to patreon.com/cinematary to sign up at the $5 a month level. In exchange, our patrons will get an exclusive bonus episode every month, weekly shoutouts on each episode of the show, and the ability to dictate a movie for us to cover eventually. If money's tight, we get it. There are still a few things you can do that we would greatly appreciate. First, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That's free to help us reach more listeners. Secondly, send us a tweet at Cinematary, or better yet, send an email to Zach@cinematary.com. That's Zach, Z-A-C-H, to let us know your thoughts, and we will read them out and respond to them on future episodes. Finally, please share the show with friends and members of your family who you think would enjoy listening to and participating in our film discussions we put out every week. So, to recap, review, send us your thoughts through Twitter and email, share with your friends and family, and sign up to be a patron. We would truly appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and now back to the show.
And we are back with part 2 of episode 272 of Cinematary. In this part, we will be continuing our Best of the Decade series with the year 2011. We'll get into the Best Picture rundown and that stuff later, but let's start out first with our picks. I think Andrew and I overlap. Nathan, I actually don't know your pick. What is your pick for your favorite or best, or however you're going to classify it for this year?
You know, I honestly forgot, but I think it was The Day He Arrives. I think it was.
It was.
You did say you wanted to come on this episode to talk about Hong Sang-soo, so that checks out.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that was my pick.
Why was that your pick? That's
Well, I mean, we can... Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Wait, yeah, I don't know what you guys picked, though.
I thought
what
we
did
were
you
going
guys
around
pick?
the table first.
I'm going to let him go first before we dig into the...
Oh, yeah, true. Facts.
We both have Tree of Life.
Yeah, this was the hardest year, I thought, of all the 2010s to pick from, because just in terms of what played internationally, what played at like art festivals and stuff, all of my like really big heavy hitters for the decade are here. It was a toss-up between Tree of Life, Meek's Cut Off, and Uncle Boomy, Who Can Recall His Past Lives. And there's also some other great movies like Certified Copy and Margaret that were in the running. But like those are the three. And I ultimately had to give it a Tree of Life. I think that's the one that's had the most resonance.
I rewatched it the other day to prep for the article. I don't think I'd watched it. It'd been since like 2012 or 2013. It'd been a while.
You didn't really like it that much
When I watched it?
originally. I remember this was the topic of conversation the first year of the show.
I had nothing against Tree of Life.
I'm sure I can find audio.
Yeah, find the
evidence
tape.
of that
I mean, that's
not
fine.
being
Yeah,
the
you can
case.
call me out, but you don't
Okay.
have the tape right now, so I can live in
I
this
don't.
obscurity. It's
Yeah.
fine. No, I watched it the other night, and first, this is kind of a very basic, boring take, but Brad Pitt is very good in that movie. I think it was just because of the kind of residuals of Ad Astra, and people were talking about how great he was in that movie. But he's in Tree of Life. He's really fantastic, and I think it's kind of funny looking back on it. I know that the kind of way that you can describe it is you have like the narrative with him and Jessica Chastain, but then you also have like the dinosaur narrative, the creation of the Earth narrative, and all of the other kind of more esoteric portions of it. But at the same time, watching it just now in 2019, all of that stuff kind of coalesces and comes together. It's not nearly as strange as kind of it was made out to be. I think in 2011, looking back at it, I was still relatively fresh into kind of trying to understand and quantify movies and make sense of them, and so that seemed like something very galaxy brain to kind of
And also, like, Malick has gotten much more fragmented and hard to follow since the release of that movie, right? So you like to Tree of Life and it feels almost classical, and how clearly it's laying everything out.
Yeah, like I said, it all of that stuff is there, but I don't know, it does work together. It does create this kind of tapestry that he's trying to make in a way that feels even now. I think the thing also, just I guess to kind of be similar to the Martin Scorsese discourse, it like this was a movie that was released by Fox Searchlight. This is a super strange movie to be released by a studio. Like I remember going to see this actually in the theaters, and when the movie ended, somebody in the theater stood up and said, "Well, that made no fucking sense," and then walked out of the theater.
All that controversy about refunds, people asking for refunds.
About the Tree of Life? I didn't hear about this.
Yes. Yeah. People were just so baffled by it. I mean, I'm sure it was one of those things that got kind of like exaggerated a little bit, but I remember some pictures going around of like signs put up at theaters saying that, they weren't going to give out refunds if you didn't enjoy or get anything out of the Tree of Life.
But one thing I wanted to kind of talk about in more the vein of like why it still resonates here in 2019 and 2020 compared to when it came out is the one thing that really struck me on this past viewing is what this movie has to say about and this is more of a topic that I don't think was as resonant in 2011 as it is now, but it really has something to say about masculinity and the ways that we as men are structured to comprehend masculinity due to the structures that we have in place, whether it's our familial structure, our kind of friends, the organizations or the places that we kind of inhabit. Like those are all influencing what defines us as really as men, as people. In this movie, again, if you're going to strip down all of the other
cosmological
more
stuff.
esoteric parts of it, if you're going to take that stuff away at the end of the day, that's what this movie is kind of about. This character that is played, the young actor who plays the kid version of Sean Penn is fantastic as well. Him as well as Sean Penn, like understanding his relationship to his father as well as just kind of trying to understand himself. I think on that basic level, this movie really, really works.
And it goes back to your point about just on a basic level, Brad Pitt is really good in this movie. It's not a showy performance at all. He's just playing a very typical Southern white Christian, like tough love dad.
Who loves Braun.
That I mean, not that part, but like I recognize parts of my own dad in him, and I recognize parts of like many friends' parents in that performance. It's very relatable for a specific demographic of people, but he's into the nuances of it and leans into it so firmly that it ends up making a statement about toxic masculinity just by like being really like naturalistic and good. But yeah, I completely agree with that.
Well, because he's constantly kind of teetering between. It's not like he is like a caricature like you usually see. He's not like constantly just like this drunk, abusive asshole. Like he has the moments where that definitely like feathers, that kind of festers up, and like you have that scene where the brother talks back to him and he like starts kind of like shoving him around, and Jessica Chastain is trying to like keep them away, and then he like goes and like grabs him and shuts him in the room. That's much more aggressive and abusive. But then you can see like in the ways that he, especially when he's processing the one son who dies, as well as just kind of processing these boys growing up, you can see him trying to process his own emotions on how to connect with them, but he kind of has that inability. I mean, he has like those moments where he gets really excited that Brahm is on the is playing on the vinyl player, and kind of is trying to get them into music. You can see the kind of the moment that he has with the middle son, where the middle son is playing guitar and he like picks up the tune that he's playing on the piano, and then he lets him lead. Like you can see him trying to find that connection, but at the same time, he just doesn't. It's like a lack of language that he has in order to convey what he's trying to get across to these younger boys, and the younger boys are just kind of there because of their age are just unable to understand what he's trying to say to them, and just that disconnect, that lack of communication because of the lack of language there is really what's causing this disconnect between the two. And I think that says the most about just masculinity in general. But speaking of masculinity in general, okay, let's talk a little bit about The Day He Arrives, because I think there's probably a number of Hong Sang-soo movies that we could talk about over the course of this decade. But this seems to be one. I know Darren Hughes, friend of the pod, is also a big fan of this film. I guess for you, Nathan, what about this one specifically feels like this needs to be kind of the highlight for Hong when it comes to the decade of his work?
I mean, I think the thing about Hong is like you don't have a favorite Hong, you have like your first Hong.
Yeah.
That's a good way to say.
Like the first one you really connect with. And so I think that was kind of one of the things. I mean, that's one of the difficulties of just making any kind of great list in general of like the top movies of a period of time or ever, is there are some filmmakers who have made a lot of great movies, but their whole body of work is kind of in conversation with itself. Like, somebody like Godard or Romer or
even Malick,
Ozu even, it's like there's just so much, and your understanding of their work is influenced by just like seeing as many as you can. And they all sort of build off of each other and are working sometimes from a similar formula, but toying with it and complicating it every time. So this was the first one that I saw, I think in like 2015 or 16 maybe. And I thought it was, for my choices every year when we were kind of planning this series, I tried to pick things that, like, whether or not I'm actually going to be on the episodes or not, just things that I liked a lot, but were maybe representative of some larger trends or phenomenon that I thought were important from this decade. And I felt like the emergence of Hong Sang-soo, he's been working for a long time, but his career has kind of reached a new level of esteem and of kind of renown over the past few years. So I thought it was really important to include him. His movies have meant a lot to me, and I think to you guys as well, and other folks in the Cinematary crew. And I think that in addition to their merits as movies, like the kind of Hong Sang-soo phenomenon, I think, is like cinephilia at its best, because I really feel like he started to get a lot of attention through an almost sort of critical kind of word of mouth, where if, you know, you look at the beginning of the decade and his movies earlier on, the distribution history, at least in the United States, is a lot spottier. And it's only in the past few years that his movies have become consistently distributed in the United States. I think his last movie that didn't get picked up for distribution in the United States is Yourself and Yours, which came out in 2016. But pretty much everything since then, I believe, has been distributed in the U.S. either by Grasshopper or Cinema Guild. And maybe Kino, I think. But, you know, those kind of like small art house distributors. And they don't often play outside of New York and LA, although the Public Cinema has consistently brought Hong to Knoxville, which is just kind of insane. I mean, I don't think anybody would have predicted that that would be possible. And I
wouldn't know who Hong is if not for Public
exactly. And so it's just kind of this sort of groundswell where, like, I first checked out The Day He Arrives because it was on Fandor, and I had for like a year or two at that point heard people talking about some of his movies. Like, I think Hill of Freedom was maybe the first one I heard about, which was around 2014. And at that time, you know, you had to like really be torrenting to see, I think, those movies. Although, like, in the 2000s, there was a sort of moment when the new Korean cinema was kind of a big wave, when Hong was getting some attention. I mean, you watch the DVD for, I think, Woman on the Beach, which came out. It's either Woman on the Beach or Woman is the Future of Man, which came out in the mid 2000s, where Martin Scorsese does a like DVD intro talking about how much he loves Hong and Korean cinema in general. But it was really, you know, kind of the middle of this decade where I think a lot of people were getting turned on to Hong. And it was just because, you know, not even sometimes professional critics, but just like people that I encountered on Twitter and on Letterboxd, you know, the amorphous social sphere that is now known as film Twitter. I was just seeing people talk about this stuff, and eventually I was just compelled to check it out. You know, this movie's 79 minutes long, so it's not that much of a risk. And I was just like incredibly intrigued. And, you know, there is, like, you introduced Hong, Zach, by talking about masculinity, which I think that toxic masculinity is a favorite topic of his, and there's a sort of fragile maleness, I think, that embodies his work. But this movie also just, I found, like, very cozy in a way, and just a very like satisfying watch, where it's just this sort of consistent wintry wavelength. And I was just like really taken in by that kind of deceptive simplicity of it, where it feels like something that is maybe almost a little slight or a little small in scope, but there is a kind of emotional complexity to the characters as well as a structural complexity, the way that he constantly re-envisions scenarios and encounters and reimagines them. And a lot of times watching a Hong movie, you know, you get halfway through and then it like starts over in a different way, you know, like in Right Now, Wrong Then, and you're just kind of disarmed. It's almost a little bit, you know, in the first part you were talking about the show, there's a kind of repetition in Hong's work, both in the movies themselves, but across movies, that is sort of, it's not, I guess it's not, you know, it's a sort of, there's a sort of serialness, a seriality, to the structure that I find very satisfying, where it's these sort of episodes. And it's like, as somebody who suffers from a lot of social anxiety, I think I find his movies very compelling, because there's this almost anxiousness to how it's sort of reimagining certain
how could this interaction have gone differently?
Exactly. You know, it's there's almost a like he's almost the kind of like Larry David, I feel like, of South Korea.
Oh, that's a good connection.
And so he's taken this place of, you know, like Woody Allen for me, and kind of satisfying that itch.
I want to go back to one point that you made about how the kind of the introduction to a director kind of influences how you see the kind of their body of work, because once you're introduced to a director, you do probably go and watch all of their stuff, but there's kind of that special place that's held by that first movie that you first saw. And I feel like this is something that we'll probably run into a decent amount of times just through this series, because we were all kind of discovering how to look at movies during this time. And I think that's a good example, because I kind of feel the same way with Hong, with Right Now, Wrong Then, because that was the first one of his that I saw. And so, I mean, what do you all, when it comes to when you first see, especially a director from kind of it doesn't necessarily be another country, but just somewhere that you're not generally looking for movies in that direction, and you come across them, like how does that influence the rest of their filmography to you?
Well, this is not so much about their filmography, but just about cinephilia in general, because I think that 2011 and probably 2012 being when I actually saw Tree of Life was a big turning point for me as someone getting into film. And all of us on the Cemetery podcast, with the exception of some veteran people who come on every now and then, we kind of became cinephiles throughout the course of the decade. And so a thing to talk about as we go through these episodes is like, well, what did we like at the time, and how have our tastes changed, and how did seeing these kind of really formative movies affect how we saw all movies. And this is the episode, for me at least, to start talking about that, because I think Tree of Life really cracked open something for me with how I was consuming film, because I was watching movies casually, and I liked movies, and I would seek out movies by directors I liked, but it was mostly kind of, you know, the typical like entry-level stuff, your Quentin Tarantino's, your Coen brothers, your Wes Andersons. And I went to see Tree of Life because it was playing on UT campus by the film committee, not cinema club, film committee. And I just went to see like any other movie, and I walked out like a changed person. And it's a really corny way to put it, I had never seen anything close to what that movie was. And I feel like for a lot of cinephiles who sort of came of like movie watching age in the 2010s, that movie specifically is sort of like their 2001, that movie that really like broke a lot of people's consciousness open to the possibilities of what movies can be. And Hong Sang-soo does that in another way, in a much more like small scale kind of intricate way. But for me, seeing Tree of Life was like the big like mind blown moment. What about for you guys?
Not necessarily with Tree of Life, but I definitely agree that that kind of works off the question that I was asking, that how do you, because you do have like that large moment where you have that kind of opening film that really sheds a light on things. I also was just kind of thinking about when you were talking, you about like the levels of kind of...
The levels of being like a film buff, quote unquote.
The tiers of like there's nothing necessarily wrong with like Wes Anderson and Terrence Malick and those names, but it's kind of like there's like different tiers that you kind of continue to go to kind of climb up, and then you enter this tier that I think is the best tier, where you just kind of everything kind of opens up and you just start exploring all of these different avenues, which makes you incredibly unfun to talk to just a normal person. But for you yourself, it's very engaging.
But I think it's almost like horseshoe theory, right? Like once you become a certain level of cinephile, you can kind of appreciate mainstream movies in a new way.
No, I agree. Yeah,
like geek out about those in the same way, and like have the same sort of critical discourse about those. Because once you start becoming a cinephile, you I mean, at least for me, have kind of a condescending, aloof a relationship to that stuff, like to mainstream
nobody likes you.
stuff. Yeah, and I think
Nobody
the
likes
early
talking to you
years
about
of our podcast is a lot of that, especially for me. But yeah, I completely agree with the point you're making, Zach.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the sort of personal narrative here, because 2011 was a crucial year for me too in cinephilia. I was still in high school at that point, but it was the summer of 2011 that I moved from my childhood home of College Station, Texas, to Knoxville, Tennessee, where we would all eventually meet. And because I had no friends, I started going to the movies regularly for the first time in my life. And I also started going to the public library, and I would check out the allowed 5 DVDs a week on my library card. And then I would get my mom's library card and check out 5 more movies on her library card. Oh, wow.
How the years change.
Things
Too many.
change.
I can't watch that many in a week.
And I would watch like 10 movies a week that summer. And then we also like had 2 TVs for the first time and a DVR. So I would like start recording movies on TCM and AMC and stuff.
I thought you were about to say you would watch 2 movies at the same time.
No, oh my God. I'm unfortunately not that hardcore. But that's where it really started happening for me. And I mean, that was a very like uncomfortable phase of cinephilia for me, because at that time my taste was very like, I think at that time Terry Gilliam was still one of my favorite filmmakers, and I was very into like whimsical kind of absurd fantastical things. And I also really liked,
so you would have liked Jojo Rabbit.
Maybe. I mean, I'll get to my like top 5 movies of that year in a second, which is very illuminating, I think. But I also really liked, unfortunately, it's a name I mentioned earlier, Woody Allen a lot at that time. And I watched like 20 Woody Allen movies the summer of 2011, including Midnight in Paris, which came out in theaters that year. And I think the thing about that is I was into that not so much just because it was Woody Allen, but just those were like those were kind of, it was like an alternative masculinity, a kind of emotional movies about emotional men, for better or worse. And, you know, as I've gotten older, and as certain things about Woody Allen himself have come to light more, but also just like as I've matured, you know, I've kind of grown apart from that. But I think Hong is somebody who has sort of taken that kind of place for me, as like he is making these just like movies about fragile men. And I also think that they really appeal to a certain kind of class of cinephile, because they are movies about critics and about people who make and watch and love movies and are very informed by that lens.
While we're talking about our taste at the time and how we've changed, I think we should also maybe talk about some of the notable big movies for a lot of cinephiles and just the general public at the time, especially if we're talking about masculinity. I think we maybe should mention Drive.
Oh God, yeah.
Which like sparked 1,000 film bros, right? And I mean, how did you guys feel about that movie at the time? How does it feel like it is related, or it is resonated now?
I would need to rewatch it. I haven't seen it in years. I liked it at the time.
Yeah. I liked it at the time too.
I have not watched it though in like 5 years.
I wasn't over the moon about it like certain people.
Yeah, no, it was a lifestyle for some people. It was not that for me.
There was somebody at our school who bought the Scorpion jacket and would wear the Scorpion jacket around all the time. Yeah.
Oh, dude. There is I will not put this person on blast by name, but there is a certain New York-based film critic who is an adult who owns a Drive jacket and wears it in public. I'm not going to say who, but that person should be embarrassed, I think.
Yeah. As we're talking about all these movies about, you know, artsy movies about masculinity, like that is a movie that definitely looks like an artsy movie and kind of posits itself as sort of being about masculinity, but I don't think it's saying anything particularly critical about masculinity, like not in a way that hurts anybody who might be coming in with a lot of like masculine assumptions, right? And like plays into a certain type of film bro and appeals to them. It's just really, it's just really like hardcore and cool. You know?
I think that Drive. So I didn't actually see it in 2011. I saw it in 2012 when it popped up on Netflix because at that time my parents were like still a little bit strict about me like seeing R-rated movies in the theaters. Gotta love, religious childhoods. So I saw it in 2012, but even before it came out, I was like, oh, I'm going to love this movie. And I was like listening to the soundtrack before it came out and was briefly really into that kind of like synth wave bullshit, which I still like that soundtrack decently. It's a
good soundtrack.
Yeah, Refn at the very least has good taste in things sometimes. Which is sometimes what he leans on instead of like actual skill or style at his worst moments. But Drive, I like Zach, I would have to revisit it because I have not seen it since that era of cinephilia. But what I remember really liking about it was the way that, like the elevator scene in that movie where it's just, this beautiful romantic moment between Carey Mulligan and Ryan Gosling. The lights are dimming, and then the dude's, Ryan Gosling takes out the hammer and just starts whacking the dudes. And the tenor of the scene just totally changes, but there's no words, used in that whole exchange. But you get this whole tenor of emotions just on the flip of a dime. And that really blew me away. And I think opened up a new way for kind of thinking about movies.
Yeah. It's very nonverbal, which I think was new to a lot of folks who saw it in 2011.
But I also think, if I can just say really quick, something like weird to compare Hong Sang-soo and Drive, but if we're talking about the kind of progression of cinephilia, I think one of the things about Hong is like when you get to Hong level, at that stage, you've reached a point where, sometimes we talk about like how, like you were saying, Andrew, you get to like that advanced galaxy brain cinephilia and you can suddenly appreciate like really obscure hardcore art house stuff and our avant-garde stuff, but you can also appreciate trash, and sometimes you ignore the middle. But I think sometimes it's less about like highbrow versus lowbrow and more about like big and little movies. And when you get to that stage, you can appreciate that kind of little, termite art, you could call it that, like you were saying, but just a small sort of very contained movie like a Hong movie. Whereas Drive, something about it is like why it's kind of over time faded for me a little bit is just because I got to a point where I would rather go for the like little messier, weirder versions of what Refn is doing, the kind of genre movies that he's absorbing and riffing on, as opposed to the more kind of prestige, grandiose, slightly pretentious version of it. But yeah, sorry.
Well, on the aesthetic level, just kind of looking at how the movie looks, I feel like it also kind of harbors in that that kind of neon 70s 80s aesthetic that we kind of are being saturated with at this point. Whether it's, I like John Wick, but John Wick is a purveyor of that. You have stuff like Mandy. You have things like Atomic Blonde. Even
horror movies like It Follows have a similar sheen to them. Like, yeah. I think that as we're talking about what were the 2010s in film, I think that one of the aesthetic tropes that we're going to come across again and again is like it's riffing on the 70s and the 80s and that neon aesthetic, but it also doesn't have the grime of those movies. It's like all that has been polished off to make it almost look like the inside of an Apple store or something like that. And Drive is maybe like ground zero for this, right?
Another perfect example of this phenomenon from this year, I think. A movie that you revisited recently, Andrew, Cabin in the Woods, I think is... I
don't know if, like, that specific aesthetic, but what was your thought on that?
Well, I think it's just kind of like, it's doing sort of things that other older horror movies have done before, but in a kind of polished, kind of the edges sanded down way, where it really is, people think it's like a very clever metatextual movie, but you pointed out in a recent little blurb about it on Letterboxd that, I mean, it's doing stuff that, Wes Craven did decades earlier, and it's not really doing anything that terribly new. It's just a little maybe glossier and just like shinier and newer.
Or pitched to an audience that hasn't gone back and watched that stuff, which was me when
like
I
Drive,
saw Cabin in the Woods,
bit.
and me when I saw Drive, and me when I saw Tree of Life, right? We are that age of cinephile.
Yeah. I mean, that also a kind of a different version, but similar sort of phenomenon of like remixing an earlier era. I mean, the movie that won Best Picture that year, which I actually enjoyed at the time because I was a little piece of shit.
I'm with you, buddy.
Which my top 5 that year, and this was mostly because I didn't see like that many movies still in theaters, and I wasn't that smart, but it was Tree of Life, Hugo, Midnight in Paris, The Muppets, and The Artist, because I was a little whimsical motherfucker. But The Artist is just like, as you get a little deeper into that kind of shit, as you just get deeper into like older movies, you realize it's just kind of like a crock of bullshit. And it's just like, why wouldn't I just watch Singin' in the Rain, which is already kind of remixing an earlier generation of movies? Why wouldn't I just watch that? Or the like 30s kind of pre-code musicals or whatever, instead of The Artist. It's just, there's no point.
And I mean, to a certain, I mean, it's kind of a different thing, but I feel the same way about Hugo. Like, I could just go watch George Milius movies. I don't need to watch like a biopic of George Milius that has some of that stuff in there.
I think Hugo is a little bit different than The Artist. I think there's a difference. There's a difference
it's
between
a pastiche. It's
there's a
working
difference
a different
between
mode.
whatever the hell The Artist is and Martin Scorsese making Hugo. Like that one. If for two movies that are very eerily similar in what they're kind of trying to do and the nostalgia they're trying to play with, I feel like Hugo has a lot more lasting power.
You're right. But I mean, also, it's, as we're thinking about what movies do have lasting power in 2019, it seems like The Tree of Life is a movie that is kind of enduring, and Drive is enduring for a certain type of cinephile. I don't see either The Artist or Hugo having any sort of lasting resonance, at least from my perspective on like film culture. I don't hear anybody talking about either of those movies.
No, I think what it is just that like Hugo, I mean, I think The Artist and Hugo are very, in some kind of way, they are very dated now, not just because of their like referencing of older movies, but just because they're very endemic of their times. I think that the Hugo, in trying to push 3D technology forward a little bit, is doing something that movies do a lot of times at cusps of like transitional technological change, where they go back to an earlier era of Hollywood history and try to integrate the new technology into that. So Scorsese basically remakes Méliès movies to connect 3D to this earlier era of silent cinema. And I think The Artist is, in its own kind of way, maybe less specifically because it's not trying to push a kind of technology forward, but I think is doing something similar, where it's just like the times are changing and this is this sort of nostalgic reaction to that. I almost feel like another example of this, which this is a movie that I see some people, it has its fans, but was kind of a big deal at the time, but has faded a lot. But I think like The Adventures of Tintin is maybe an example of that, where, going back to this old comic, this kind of classic adventurous swashbuckling tale to debut a sort of innovative motion capture technology that didn't really stick with, that didn't really kind of land successfully. And, that was supposed to be a series and a franchise, but hasn't really panned out that way.
You could maybe see a similar dynamic happening with a movie I haven't seen but want to, Alita Battle Angel, this year.
Oh, yeah. No, I think that's actually like, because you have a similar relationship there between like Robert Rodriguez and James Cameron as you do with Peter Jackson and Steven Spielberg. I'm just looking at 2011 movies, and
I know we mentioned it a little bit. I think that there is some relevancy despite where people stand with Woody Allen at the moment with Midnight in Paris, at least in the subject that it's dealing with in that movie.
Yeah. I mean, the subject of nostalgia is of forefront importance in that movie. And if we are going to judge Woody Allen films just on quality, and not on like how they're connected to his personal life, like that is the one like late Woody Allen movie that you would point people to, right?
Well, and I think that just the kind of thesis of that movie being like, because you have the Owen Wilson character who's nostalgic for a specific period of time, and then he goes to that specific period of time, and those people are nostalgic for another period. I think that like that cycle of nostalgia, the point he's making with that is kind of interesting, just in terms of how we're
the fact that The Artist and Hugo both came out the same year, and that we're kind of in this kind of nostalgia cycle with like Martin Scorsese and Marvel like at the same time at this very moment.
Well, even I was just on Letterboxd. I had like 2011 movies pulled up, and I had it filtered to stuff that I have seen, but I just removed that. So I'm looking at like all the most popular movies right now, and you even see this theme of nostalgia running through some other movies from the year, like Captain America, the First Avenger, going back to the 40s, X-Men First Class going back to the 60s, Rise of the Planet of the Apes remaking this iconic, bygone franchise.
Well, like at this point, we're deep into, I talked about this in my Unbreakable video essay, we're deep into this post like Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings cycle of like just making franchise movies based on pre-existing properties people know.
Yeah, I mean the fucking Green Hornet.
And Tintin is a symptom of that. Yeah.
Came out that year.
And none of these movies have lasting power, right? Like fucking I mean, I guess some people like Captain America, the Winter Soldier, or whatever, but like just looking at these lists of like Pirates of the Caribbean and Tintin and Rise of the Planet of the Apes and Sherlock Holmes and another Mission Impossible movie, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. And I don't hear anyone talking about these films like they were the biggest deal ever when they came out. And you probably had to have a take on them if you were part of like the film culture community at the time, which I wasn't. But they are disposable at the end of the day. And the movies that people are talking about are maybe a little bit more, I don't know, low key or more unique at the very least, right?
I mean, I think that some movies that people have, that they're maybe more a little like cinephile cult favorites almost, but they have a sort of sustained, enduring following. But something like Moneyball or Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy,
which both of those kind of feel like post-Social Network dramas.
I think it's
right.
No, I was going to say that Brad Pitt was having a wonderful year that year. Because his performance in Moneyball is also really good. if I need to rewatch that, I just remember it being fantastic. I should probably revisit that. It also introduces us to Chris Pratt. He's in that movie as well. Just a little fun fact for Moneyball fans.
Oh God, I totally forgot that.
Anything kind of closing as we're hitting the 40-minute mark? Is there anything kind of that you want to wrap up on 2011?
I think that as my closing thought, I will mention 3 movies that I noticed came out this year. 3 little movies that are very unique digital experiments in their own way. The first one is Francis Ford Coppola's Twixt, which is his last, as of right now, feature film that's been released. Jafar Panahi's This Is Not a Film, made by the imprisoned filmmaker Jafar Panahi and smuggled out of Iran. And then the found footage movie Snow on the Bluff, directed by Damon Russell, starring Curtis Snow, which is this sort of like insane day in the life, maybe real, maybe not.
Yes.
Yeah, found footage horror movie, basically about a drug dealer, and it's just like some very wild shit and very layers of reality and unreality, maybe. But I think
that movie might be a 2012 release for the United States, but I can co-sign it completely. It's a great film.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, festivals and shit. It premiered, at the very least, it premiered at festivals in 2011, and I think was, released theatrically in 2012.
And overlooked, for sure.
I don't know. All of those, I think, are kind of endemic of, we were talking about these sort of, like, for me, Hong was this kind of like small little gem of the decade, and I think all of those movies are maybe dealing with like changes in technology and whatnot in more productive ways than the nostalgia of something like The Artist, and are all responding to a transitional era in a new decade in very unique ways.
As my closing thought, I will say that I am really happy with the Tree of Life. Like if we only have one movie representing that year, I think that's probably the one, and it certainly was formative for me, like I said. If we're talking about other voices that kind of emerged in the 2010s or continued into the 2010s that became very important throughout this decade, I do think people should, just like Hong Sang-soo, make sure they are watching movies by Pitchapong Weerasethakul. Uncle Boonmi came out that year, and he made several other great films throughout the decade. And I also think that, looking at my list, 2011 was a really good year for movies made by women who would then go on to be big names in the film scene. You have Kelly Reichardt with Meek's Cutoff, who had already made a couple movies at that point. We Need to Talk About Kevin by Lynn Ramsey. Tomboy by Celine Sciamma, who, her new movie was one of our favorites at TIFF, and then Pariah by Dee Rees, who we did an episode on with Mudbound. So if those are new titles to anybody listening to this, they should go check all of those out for sure.
Definitely. I co-sign that. Well, cool. Well, I believe this will wrap up this episode of Cinematary. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cinematary, on Twitter at handle @Cinematary, on Letterboxd at letterboxd.com/Cinematary, where we have all the episodes that we talked about in this 2011 rundown. And then, of course, you can check us out on Patreon. We have a nice film theory and chill, a little spooky one for you guys. If you want to check it out.
Really good episode.
Including the exclusive first time ever recounting of my role in the Great Space Ghost Perp Little Shark Beef of 2014. That is some real hot shit that you can't get anywhere else at all.
That's the content that we got coming. I can also say if you join, go ahead and join the Patreon, and we're a fan of the Newsreel podcast, we'll have a very special Patreon end of the year thing going on the Cinematary Patreon, where I resurrect Brian from the dead.
That is the first time I'm heard about that,
and it's exclusive right now. Breaking news.
Wow.
So.
Okay.
Yeah, I've brought him back from because it's all Brian's fault that crumple apart. So he's not listening to this part, so it's fine.
You're not talking about the Scorsese beef.
Exactly. But thank you to our patrons: Cam, Chad Newsom, Christopher Metcalf, Eric Dukowski, Graham Jones, Harry Eskin, Maggie, Marie Barty, Matthew Lingo, Ron Hayes, Tyler Chandler, Whitney Rio Ross, and Will Carroll. Thank you so much for your patronage. Next week, we will be doing the year 2012. Are we going to talk about the movie 2012?
I will not.
Did that come out in 2012?
Surely it did.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I would assume so. Well, we're going to talk about that. That's the movie of that year. So we'll go ahead and put that in stone. Thank you guys for listening, and we will see you next week.